thank you to UPE, Tiffany, Alex, and Hugh for making this happen. Hector, Tito Callejas, and Rocio for also collaborating on the project while I've been gone. So we founded the Latinos in Tech Initiative at COPR, or I helped found it, and now I'm on my field work here in Mexico. So I've been traveling 2 days to get here, but I'm excited to be here and hopefully have a productive conversation. So I think one place where we overlap in the COPR LTI initiative and in the UPE superCS Crushing Stereotypes talk series is that we're trying to bridge distinct publics and have a conversation. Does anyone recognize the text on these individuals' shirts? It says, "Talk is cheap, show me the code." No? Seriously? Who's a computer science major? Okay. Who is not a computer science major? Okay. All right, here's a good question. Who here considers themselves a hacker? Who uses Linux? Who knows who Linus Torvalds is? Okay, so he's famous for saying, "Talk is cheap, show me the code." Yes? Okay. So in my plan, I was going to ask, does anyone recognize the text? And a bunch of people would say, Linus Torvalds, and I say, yes, see, some people recognize it and some people don't. We have very distinct publics, but maybe it's the same. So in the UP series, what I understand is that they're saying, or you're saying, listen, the diversity in tech discourse has sort of gone public, especially after these diversity numbers are released by these big companies. So let's actually hear from some people of color with lived experiences navigating these tech worlds. And in the CLPR, we're saying, wait a minute, diversity, difference, these are issues we attack directly in the social sciences, ethnic studies, anthropology. So let's kind of talk about, we've had critical thinkers address these issues in other domains of social life, not just tech, although there needs to be more work in tech. So let's bridge these two different conversations. So I'm going to try to fill the gaps today by doing two things. First, giving you a brief overview of my experiences. So I started as an undergrad computer science at MIT, did some consulting work after undergrad, and now I'm an anthro student in the PhD program here at Berkeley. So in the process, I'll try to figure out also how I got here, but also try to build on a conversation that's more critical and more systemic than the usual conversation we have on diversity in tech. So something I want to use to organize the talk is this concept of borderlands. So for 1 second, I want you to talk to your neighbor and just talk about what you understand by borderlands. So take 30 seconds.
What would GWS say?
Es la tierra que no está cerca. Pero Chile es muy delgadito, igual no, porque es muy
Oh, is this your phone?
Okay, borderlands, who has an idea?
I don't know, like a borderland is sort of, it's physical but not physical. It's a space where you're trying to, I don't know, create your identity, where you're sort of split apart into different parts and they're interacting with one another, sort of creating your identity.
Okay. Thank you. You were going to say something?
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, like, I think about borderlands as the buffer between the US and Mexico. So like the borderland states, like California, Arizona, New Mexico, like mix of culture as a result of being separated by this wall between the US and Mexico.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
I just think borderlands as synonymous with frontier. Incorporating the previous few discussions, there's the removal from the normal and standard sort of room to experiment, but on the second point, at least as I've heard it used in the U.S. and its literature, it sort of de-emphasizes that there's something on the other side of the border. Rather it's what delimits what's us from presumably implicitly from everything else, but the everything else isn't really mentioned when say frontier is used, and that's for saying for borderlands.
Hey, great. I think we got to it. Has to do with identity, has to do with a geographical location, maybe something very specific like the US-Mexico border. But in general, it could be something that has to do with self and other, as I think you're getting to, and back to this theory of the frontier. In my ideal world, also, we were going to have a computer scientist and a social scientist arguing about borderlands. Maybe someone that isn't familiar with borderlands as a concept, and think about maybe borders in like the computer science way. When you think about borders and programming, what do you think about? Test cases, exceptions? Does that kind of ring a bell, or am I thinking too much into it? You want to say
What about like an abstraction barrier?
Mhm.
Or right, we abstract. What about like an abstraction barrier? Or right, we abstract away the details, or it's this facilitation of between the details and the bigger.
Okay, right. So when I transferred to the social sciences from a computer science background, when I heard people talking about relationality and object-oriented programming and what is the essence of an object, sort of connected with computer science, thinking about exceptions and what will make the program break here, right? So I wanted to kind of get to that and talking about borderlands, but yes, I am getting more to a theoretical borderlands, specifically from Chicano Latino thinkers, thinking about producing knowledge from a different epistemic position, usually an oppressed position. So when we think about borderlands, between computer science and social science, let's say, we're thinking, one of the last speakers in this series was a white woman, and someone in the end asked her, well, how do you compare your experiences to a person of color experiences in tech? And she said, well, I'm not sure because I've never met one. So we see here how we have also a very connected issue of intersectionality, right? You could be giving a perspective from a woman's perspective, or maybe it's a white woman. What about when a Latino person gives their perspective, but it's a man? We have this issue of intersectionality that we need to address, which also blends into a concept that one of my favorite professors here at Berkeley, his name is Ramon Grosfoguel, talks about the oppression Olympics. So when we're talking about diversity, all of a sudden we have women, we have the queer movement, we have Latinos, like it's kind of this Olympics of who's more oppressed. And I'm saying it somewhat sarcastically. It's very real, but we get into these issues of overlapping hierarchies of oppression. Something I want to keep from this borderlands conception is this idea of border thinking. Especially in ethnic studies, we have the idea of counter narratives. So I want to give my perspective or my experience in this world and just let it kind of tell itself and be a counter narrative in the typical narrative of the hacker, of the computer, of geekdom, of hackerdom. So the next border I want to talk about is between hacking anthropology and anthropology of hacking. So when you think of anthropology, what do you think about?
Well, I'm an anthropology major, so study.
Okay.
It's four main fields, but when most people think of anthropology, they think of going to some far-flung country and studying a foreign culture.
Okay, so foreignness. And you're an anthro major, so you probably know a lot more.
Yeah. But
Non-anthro major, what do you think about when you think about anthropology?
think about people that people watch with the microscope or
Okay.
like with the magnifying glass, and they look at people underneath that magnifying glass, and they're like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And they're trying to understand it in that context underneath the magnifying glass. But that's because I'm on anthropology.
But it's very close, right? It's trying to look at some community and bound the community and make observations about them. Or at least that's what people think about anthropology, and there's some exoticism to it. There's some different community or group. Okay. What about computer science people? What do you think about when you think about hacking?
Breaking into a system you don't have access to.
Okay. Anybody else? Something illegal. Okay. So it has to do with criminality, doing something you're not supposed to be doing. Does anybody have any alternate definitions of hacking?
I kind of think of anonymous, so how like it can be used for like some type of social good, even though that's debatable. Like data leaks, you know, like that's really important in a way.
Okay.
CS major, so sort of comp this, but more general. There's the idea of transgression, but also of also a bit of transcendence as well. You're doing things that you aren't supposed to, but involved in that is meaning that say you understand the system better than those using it against you. Hence you I guess you make the machine does what you want, even if someone else didn't want, someone else intended otherwise. Similar, it also sort of extends beyond that, just doing more than what is expected or thought possible.
Great. So it has to do again with some sort of transgression, but it's not necessarily a negative transgression, or it's using some sort of curiosity, intellectual exploring to understand how a system works and possibly use it for social good, even though someone might not want you to be doing that. Okay, so we're developing different definitions of hacking, and we'll get further into what the different definitions of hacking, what the different generations of hacking have been, as some scholars describe them, or some hackers themselves. So let's keep that in mind. And finally, the last border I want to talk about is diversity in tech versus the diversity discourse. So what I'm thinking about here is that as minorities, underrepresented minorities, we have this discourse about diversity, how to have a more inclusive environment, whether it be tech, whether it be academia, and we benefit from it in some ways. I don't want to go into affirmative action per se and its policies, but we get some of these fellowships and we navigate the academy with some of these benefits or retributions, if we want to call them that. But at the same time, we're critical of it. And within it, we can develop critique and alternate visions for what real diversity might be. So there's big overlap here, or what I see is there's parallels with the discourse of diversity in academia. And one thing we see also with the diversity discourse is that it's all about individual accomplishments. Sometimes you hear people say, well, I did this and I did this. I'm a Latino person, I'm a black person, so why don't you do it? So does anyone know what that's called? This pick yourself up by your bootstraps narrative? Okay. It's kind of part of neoliberalism. We want to move against that, not about this individual accomplishments, but what are the actual systemic issues that we need to get past to have an actual inclusive environment. So with that, I want to tell you about my accomplishments. Just kidding. But I want to give you a brief overview of my trajectory and try to pull anecdotes from it to have a conversation about it. So rewind about 10 years, maybe 8 years. 8 years when I was at MIT in undergrad, and one of the projects I worked on with Taiwanese grad student at the MIT Media Lab, his name was Edward Chen, he's a smart guy, you can look him up, was this project when we were trying to develop a smart storytelling interface. So you come back from a trip, you have this corpus of media, videos, images, and you want to create a interesting story with it. So the idea was you're telling your story, you drag the different video clips, and the system gives you some smart feedback so that you can create an interesting narrative. So systems engineers, designers, do you have any ideas for how to make this work, or where would I start? What's the first thing I need to do? I need to compare the images or videos, right? So in order to compare them, what do I need? They need to be annotated in some way, right? Okay. And then I want to create interesting stories. So how do I decide if a story is interesting? It's trending now in a sense too with big data to create stories out of the data. So how do I tell an interesting story? Who decides what's interesting? Compelling. So some ideas we had were find related videos that other people had submitted. So the content is one thing, and the underlying structure is another. So in order to compare the videos, they need to be annotated, and we need to have some way to compare them. And to compare the structure, we need to have some way to implement the structure. So we started thinking about this idea ConceptNet at the Media Lab, which is, it was meant to say, all right, computers should have common sense, so they should have all the knowledge that is out there in the world. So we started developing a graph. The nodes represent concepts, terms, and the edges represent their relationality. So in order to make coffee, you need to first pour it, and then afterward you pick it up. So are people familiar with these types of graphs? Maybe I'm so old school 7 years ago that we've moved beyond this. Are there computer science students? Do we still use these kind of common sense computing methods? No, yes? Okay. Well, what I got from this was that there was some systematic way to make comparisons between different concepts that perhaps are different in different cultures and different languages. So I started thinking about storytelling and how to map out cultural differences. Maybe the beginnings of it in anthropology. So returning to this idea of hacking, we've given some different ideas of what hacking may be. So we want to move away from this kind of popular idea that hacking has to do with some malicious, criminally related activity. So if you look at historians that have written about hacking, it started with the Tech Model Railroad Club at MIT. So back in the 60s, there was these guys hanging out in the 20s buildings at MIT working on railroads and tinkering with technology in a sense. Not computers necessarily, computers were related, but they were thinking about how to solve problems, and there was a lot of AI in the process too. Does anyone recognize or know about Richard Stallman? So what do you know about Richard Stallman? Anything? Uh-huh, okay. So he developed Emacs. What was Emacs? Huh? The text editor? Okay, text editor. Uh-huh.
Emacs as part of the GNU user space, and also most famous today for its licensing and the idea of free software. As related to hacking, basically the idea that when you have software that you use, you should be able to access the source code, so you can understand how it works and change it to suit your needs instead of having to depend on the original writers or the being at mercy of the original writers or maintainers for the functionality of what you're using.
Okay. So Richard Stallman is supposedly the last hacker on Earth, right? They give him this name because he has this very romantic idea about what hacking should be, and he has a particular ethics that you should follow. So information should be free. You should have access to all the source code. What about Linus Torvalds, though? He has the same principles in a sense. I mean, he helped develop Linux. But where they start to clash, or where all these different personalities start to clash, is whether you should make money or not from hacking, right? So there's these different waves of hacking. So that's 60s, 70s, and the 80s. They start to move to California, right? So they kind of spread away from MIT, Cambridge. They move to California and start enjoying the California sun, and they're not these geeky guys anymore. At least that's how they're described, right? These geeky guys in a basement somewhere. They're having parties, and well, they're kind of making a lot of money too, right? So where they start to clash is whether this disciplined activity and hacking should be used to make money or not. And people like Linus don't like Stallman because they say he's too much of a black and white thinker. Like either you're against the system or you're with the system. And Linus seems to think you can work within the system and make money and use that money to create open structures. Does anyone have an opinion on those hacker wars? There's a book waiting to be written, I think, called Hacker Wars. Is this familiar to people, or is this like new information? I'm just trying to get a feel for what you guys are familiar with. Some people are familiar with it. Are you familiar with? Okay. So enter my research and what I'm trying to do with it. So I'm looking at hacker culture in Mexico. So what does that mean? We have these groups, for example, that form hacker schools. The first hacker school has opened in Mexico City. And they have these very, very explicit rules for how to be a hacker. So here in Spanish it says, su connotación se refiere a una virtuosidad técnica, pero también a una manera juguetona de ser. Anyone want to translate?
It's like a virtuous technical field, but it's also like so much fun just to be in it. Something like that.
Okay.
Or I don't really know.
Okay, so they're referring to what hacker means. It means there's some technical virtuosity, but it's also a playful way to be. So what I'm trying to get at is the circulation of hacking practices, ethics, and rules for being a hacker. So here's where the anthropologist enters, right? When people like Stephen Levy write books like, there's a book called Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, he's picking out what the rules that these hackers follow are without them being explicit about it. Well, now I have a community in Mexico that you go to their blog, you go to their site, and they have these rules for how to be a hacker. So in some ways, it's easy to be an anthropologist, right? You kind of just say, well, that's how they function. But then you get the sense that how people say they're going to act and how they really act don't always match up. So how is this hacking way circulating? So from MIT, does anybody recognize any of these hacks? This playful way of being. You recognize this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought it was going to be a police car or something.
So that's so I think in 2001, they put a fire truck up there commemorating September 11th. Do you want to say something to this?
I was like, that's a Kennedy steal from Caltech.
Right. So when I was there, they brought a cannon over from Caltech, which started the Caltech MIT Wars. And in our campus preview weekend, you get this shirt and it says MIT in the front. And you get the shirt and you put it on, and in the back it says, because not everybody gets into Caltech, or not everyone can go to Caltech. They start having these playful ways of finding ways to break into the system. So what is the system they're breaking with t-shirts? Rules, right? People will maybe put on a t-shirt and they don't even look at what the back says. How do you think they got the fire truck up there? What are some ways you can get the fire truck up there?
The helicopter?
Okay.
No.
So that's one way. I mean, what's another way? Anything.
Assemble it.
Okay, assemble it by parts.
Fake knockoff.
It could be cardboard or something. gonna be a hologram. What about an obvious one?
A ramp.
Huh?
Some type of ramp.
Okay, yeah. What about just a picture and they photoshopped it and started circulating? So this is what they call hacks, right? And there's all these very famous hacks. If you go to hacks.mit.edu, there's some good ones you can look at. But what I want to get at here is that it has to do with there's not necessarily technology involved. You're not necessarily breaking into a system. It has to do with being playful in some way. Okay, so what else do I want to get at? You start to get a culture of hacking, right? Which is a good thing. What I see is that institutions like MIT, they develop these programs in Mexico teaching kids how to be hackers, how to be irreverent, how to be against authority in some ways, which is good. But at the same time, and we go back to social science, this is classic ways to say there's something wrong with you and you should be this way, right? If you look at a book called Hackers and Painters by Paul Graham, he has this idea that being a hacker is equal to being American. So this way of being innovative and creative is specifically comes from an American way of being unruly and breaking rules. Does anyone see problems with that? Do you want to say something? Yeah.
There's sort of obvious to explain, but more than that, there's this sort of implicit devaluation of certain things not associated with the playfulness and exploration. So for example, while these traits are arguably less encouraged in America, just the idea of use sociality and putting effort into getting along, being serious at times, being utilitarian in that you plan things out and ration what you present to others. All of these are sort of brushed aside by the idea that to be a ideal citizen you should be a hacker.
Okay. Good. And this is the rhetoric of civic hacking, right? When you said citizenship, like the civic hacking all of a sudden is being a full-time citizen is equivalent to being a hacker. So great. You want to say something?
I think on the same note, it kind of brushes aside like other cultures or ways of living. Say being American, it's the same as being American.
Right. So there's hegemony directly involved in it. Great. So go back to my MIT. Are there any meme scholars in the room? Meme scholars. Does anyone recognize this meme? So this is a meme. The individual here around 2012 started circulating a lot, especially in Spanish language. Is it Spanish language? Do they recognize this? Okay, so his name's San Juan Cholo, or that's what they named him, and he represents urban dweller, probably from a place like Tepito, from Mexico City, and it started circulating with this text. You're gonna have to excuse my language here, but this is what it says: "Me vale vergas," which means like I don't give. It's a very vulgar word for penis, but it's the way you would talk if you were from the inner city in Mexico, and they would put this image that to all these different kinds of content. All right, I thought this image was funny, but why do I say this? And it's from the streets thing. So anecdote from my MIT days, I was taking a class on how to give a presentation. This was a very good exercise. We had to give a talk to high school students and describe a problem. And you start to learn that once you have to describe a problem to high school students or to your grandma, grandpa, you actually are able to explain exactly how this concept works. So, for example, how to explain how a cache works in computer science. Can anyone explain it in simple terms? A computer cache, how does it work? Does anyone know what a computer cache is? What is it? Does someone want to say what it is?
It's basically like Aaron
area where you store things you accessed recently in case you need them again. You can get them quicker than you would everything else.
Okay. So what's another way to explain that to someone in non-computer terms?
I would think of it like a cheat sheet in your exam, knowledge that you need to access immediately at that moment, versus going back home to read all your books where all the knowledge is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. A good example I heard was it's like going to the library and the librarian has a backpack and he or she has the most recent or the most accessed books in his backpack and he doesn't have to go back and get the book. So he starts to get heavier, but it kind of helps the system in the long run. So you can come up with analogies like this. So I gave a talk on at this point back in the day Napster, how peer-to-peer file sharing works. And it was very good. The high school kids liked it, maybe because I was teaching them how to download things. I was like the audience favorite award, right? Yeah, I had a good presentation. And then the professor said something like, yes, it's so good. You've come a long way. When you first started the class, it sounded like you were from the streets. I guess thank you or something in a way, but kind of reflect on this, and I write about this in my personal statements. It's thinking about how you have to speak and present yourself for people to listen to you and to kind of be valued, right? So it has to do with language ideologies, what you have to appear to be to people in order to be valuable in a certain social field or in a certain domain. So immediately after MIT, I did consulting work for Deloitte Consulting. So for a Big Four firm, my idea was I don't really know what I want to do. This is a good chance to explore different companies, different industries, get a lot of experience. So this is not a picture of me, but this is a visual image. If you Google consulting, it's kind of this, right? A happy white guy comes and shakes your hand, how to make your company better. So my experience in consulting was not like that. Is anyone thinking about going into tech consulting? Okay. What are some reasons you want to do it? Right. It's good for the resume. It's wonderful for the resume. You get all these different experiences, and when you want to apply to other jobs, you can kind of pick and choose them and align them to that opportunity. What I was really doing was doing work on Excel that probably most high school students can do, and they would tell me, you have to stay until after the client. So you have to be the last person there because they're paying a lot of money for you. I thought it was almost like slavery. I had to be in front of my computer, not necessarily doing anything productive, but showing that I was being productive. So, very quickly I realized I wasn't going to be there long, but they had given me a signing bonus. So I waited until the 2 years was up. But that last year was a fun time to work for them because I knew I wasn't going to follow their narrative of career advancement and all of this. So then I quit my job and I moved to Mexico for a while. Oh, sorry. Last experience in the consulting business. So I got to go to Mexico City and work for Walmart to update their tech systems. Yeah, these were dark times in my life. But I had the privilege, or maybe not privilege, but I was a mediator between the American consultants and the Mexican workers. Being bilingual, they had me as a translator, and I had to be the mediator in between a lot of discussions. But as consultants, you're supposed to make the business more effective. So one story I always give is that there was this nice man that would come in every morning and say hi to everyone. Very very gentlemanly Mexican man. You come in, you say hi to everyone in the room, you give a kiss. You spend your 20 minutes welcoming people in the morning. And they wanted me to tell him not to do that because he was wasting time. He needed to be more productive. And it was in this difficult position that I realized, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with business. It's culture. It's cultural, right? These people don't understand this welcoming and saludando, saying hi to people in the morning. And these are experiences I have here at Berkeley. I mean, sometimes I walk into a room and people don't even acknowledge me. And to me, that's very weird. I'm used to going into a room and having everyone say hi to you and acknowledging you. Maybe not everyone feels that way, but it's a cultural clash. So I started becoming interested in anthropology. So I moved to Mexico, took some anthro classes in a small city, Jalapa, Veracruz. And there was a professor collecting oral narratives from the state of Veracruz. I helped her build a website to to store these narratives, for people to retrieve them. And I had this idea that I was going to make some formula that would show that all these narratives are the same. If you break them down into their components, they all follow one narrative structure. And I was going to show how the narratives in Veracruz, maybe Mexico, were the same. So I proposed that idea, came to the folklore program in Berkeley, realized there was a Russian guy, Vladimir Prot, who had done just the same thing for Russian folktales. So I kind of had to switch projects, and also his critique for being nationalistic, simplistic, etc., etc. Next project in the folklore program, I went to computer class for a group that identifies as Maya. And working with them, I realized that when I would present on the type of work I was doing there, this was kind of what people wanted me to present, right? There's this fascination with indigenous people in front of a computer. Well, you know, the Maya people I worked with in Oakland. Did I say it was in Oakland? The Maya people were driving Mustangs and listening to Kanye West and looked nothing like this. But people expected me to present something that made me uncomfortable. So I have a problem with anthropology in a sense for this reason, for exoticizing their research subjects. So we go back to this hacking anthropology versus anthropology of hacking. So I think what I want to say here is, in one, we're trying to hack anthropology in that we're trying to move away from the typical communities they study. And anthropology of hacking is literally looking at the hacker community. So moving between the two, or using one to having them work together. So what do I mean by that? So one methodology that I want to use in my research, and I'm opening it up to suggestions from you all, is I have my participants log into this program called Immersion. So if you go to immersion.mit.edu, there's this crazy guy. He's a program called Macro Connections Group at Media Lab. This Chilean guy, what's his name? Cesar Hidalgo. So he does these cool programs like Immersion. You log in, you give the program permission to take your email metadata, so to, from, the timestamp and the CC, and it builds this graph. The nodes represent people who use email. You get a slider, and then it builds clusters around the different communities you have. And you get a slider, and you get to go back in your email and see how these change. Has anyone seen this before? Okay, so it's a neat tool. And the usual, what people would do is use this and do some social network analysis, which would imply how would you analyze the graph? So it would be quantitative in a way. But what are the limitations here? I don't necessarily email everyone I talk to. Email might not necessarily be important in Genesis.
Yeah, like, so I was thinking, like, what this implies, it implies that you have a social network, right? So, like, you're saying your email doesn't show everybody that's in your social network, and not only that, but your frequency of, like, emailing somebody may not mean, like, that you're close to them.
It's often the opposite of who you're close to. I know least frequently the people that I'm most close to.
Great, yeah, exactly. So I want to get at the subjectivity. So for a methodology, what could I do to get at those subjectivity? So literally I sit with people, I have them use this and ask them questions. So who are these people? Why haven't you emailed this person? And I think these visualization tools are good for people to reflect on the type of communities they build, the type of networks they build. And for the research I'm trying to do in Mexico, where this tech startup ecosystem, hacking ecosystem is very new, I think it's a good way to get to how people build these certain networks. And we see that when we talk about Silicon Valley and what's going on with the startup ecosystem here, it's about the network you have, right? Like who you know and why you create those relationships. So something I do in my research is show up to all these hackathons, especially in Mexico. So who has attended a hackathon? Okay, so most people. People who haven't attended one, what do you understand by a hackathon?
I don't understand.
You don't understand what it is. What do you think a hackathon is?
It looks like everyone just hanging out. Computers.
They're all on Facebook. Okay.
Yeah, we do.
So what is a hackathon? Hackathon participants. So they take different forms too, depending on who sponsors them. But the idea is you show up, you pick a few people. Usually it's a very well combined team. So you have a designer, a hacker, a computer programmer, a business person, and you develop some application. It could be something you're going to sell and create into a startup, or it could be something that attacks a social issue, a real social issue. So one of the most productive kind of hackathons I've seen is this one called Migra Hack. So they are addressing a specific issue, immigration, and trying to come up with tools and visualizations to hack migration. So for example, this team that developed this program their team is called Niñez Detenida. So between, when was it, in the last few years, we have more than 20,000 child migrants that have wound up in the US and across Mexico. And they built a tool to help visualize where they are and how they're coming to the US. So one thing I see is a lot of these hackers too, especially when you see their readings, they talk about community and they say it's all about community. The technology you build, sometimes you don't even end up implementing it. It's all about what kind of networks you form there, what type of community you build. So here in these Migra hack events, I see that people from the community show up, they end up building lasting relationships, and it's not necessarily about the technology, because I have somewhat of a problem with these very deterministic ways of solving problems, right? You want to create an app that is, I don't know, going to decentralize authority all of a sudden, supposedly. So back to the work I do in Mexico City, they have these very precise definitions about what a hacker is. So here it says, una persona que disfruta explorar los límites de lo posible por curiosidad intelectual. So someone who likes to explore the limits of the possible and is intellectually curious. So again, going back to how they're developing these very specific definitions for what it means to be a hacker. Here I want to show you some of their ethics, right? So here's some of the students I meet with and work with in Mexico City. And they also have this list of what it is that their ethic is, right? So give before you get, don't ask for permission, you're always doing instead of talking, there's no excuses. We jump to number 7, says know your tools and your communities. So I want to focus on that one. So know your tools and your community. Some common rhetoric in the hackathon movement is that you want to use what other people know in order to create projects. So if you have a good developer, you use the developer's tools, his knowledge in order to create your system. Maybe you're just a good business person, so you focus on the business. You learn some programming, but you focus on the business. So what does that lead to for developers? What leads to this? You get Jose, the developer here, and you have all the different managers kind of knowing their community, right? So, all right, so I'm nearing the end here, and I want to, like, what do I take away from this, or what do I want you to take away from this or understand? So there's overlapping hierarchies, right? This Jose image I show, another anecdote I give is when I'm on my computer sometimes, working, doing some actual work, my dad, who's a migrant, was used to real work, like hard labor in the fields. Maybe some of you have this experience with some of your parents. They're like, what are you doing? And they think I'm on Facebook, or even though I might be working on Facebook, and I say, I'm working. And he kind of laughs, like, oh, yeah, you're working, right? So, but in a sense, he's happy, I feel, or they're happy because they struggle to come here, and there's a certain privilege in not having to do this hard labor, right? But what I think, so in a sense, it's a privilege to be working on the computer. But what I think he doesn't understand is this, right? That in the world of tech development, programmers can be in other hierarchies where they're the oppressed individuals. So I think we should work on on valuing the work that programmers do. I think it's tedious, boring, disciplined work that we have to do sometimes as programmers. And to work against that, we have to give it value. One anecdote I have also in Mexico, I heard a guy say in one of these spaces that's all about tech entrepreneurship, he made a comment like, ideas don't belong to those who work them. And I almost like wanted to cry or something because it's exactly the opposite of, for example, Zapata that said land belongs to those who work it. This guy is saying the opposite, right? And these are the same type of characters that I see show up to hackathons, kind of salivating, looking for the good programmer, and they have this idea in their head that they think is going to revolutionize things, and they're like protecting their idea, and they think they're these very creative individuals. No offense to anyone if you feel this way, but I'm sorry, everyone has very good ideas. It's all about who can actually develop them and work in a team to develop them. I'm against this like guarding your ideas and thinking you have a super idea. So you can take issue with that if you want. What are we good at as programmers? So we're good at building abstractions, models, looking for patterns, and writing very clearly. So something also. So has anyone read this Paul Graham book, The Painters and Hackers? Hiroshi, I know you read it. So he says something like, programming should not be done how they taught us in school. I don't know how they teach you computer science here, but you take a paper and you draw out the system first, and then you start developing, right? So he says, no, that's not kind of how it works. You kind of just get into it. He calls it sketching because he went into painting after programming. So you kind of just sketch out, you kind of start programming, then go back and like fix it, and this is how you develop code. Sure, but people work in different ways, and I think in general, we're very good at seeing the overall design, shuttling into different layers of abstraction. So one of my favorite quotes from a sociologist, C. Wright Mills, he says the capacity to shuttle between levels of abstraction with ease and with clarity is a signal mark of the imaginative and systematic thinker. So hackathons and diversity, again, this idea that we have different skills and we should work together to work on similar problems I like, and it starts to mirror some of this diversity talk. But what is real diversity? I mean, I want to hear ideas from you guys. What do you think real diversity is? Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful quote, and I can't remember who says it, but it's something along the lines of the people who build technology should mirror the people who use it.
Okay. So you should understand what your users are doing.
I think that was the context of like the people who are building technology should be a representative sample of the users,
Okay.
or population in general, so that they can have a real understanding of people.
Got it. Okay, good. Anything else? I think it's important to listen. So I'm doing a lot of firsts in Mexico in this tech business, right? So we did the first women's hackathon, and there was this whole conversation about whether it should be just for women, whether we should open it up to everybody. And I think in the end, I mean, it's fine if, for example, women, non-women, men come to the hackathon, but step back and listen to what the issues are, right? And I think that's what diversity, in a sense, should be. You walk into a class here, and everyone is on the same level, and you should be able to contribute equally. But that's in the ideal utopic sense, right? So I want to end with this quote that I like by Wittgenstein, which my advisor uses in one of his papers. It says, when one draws a boundary, maybe for various kinds of reasons, by surrounding an area with a fence or a line or otherwise, the purpose may be to prevent someone from getting in or out, but it may also be part of the game, and the players be supposed, say, to jump over the boundary. So I think it ends with some of this playfulness that I'm trying to get to with the hacker movement, jumping across boundaries, seeing the games being played on both sides. And I'll end with that. Open up to you guys if you have questions or want to discuss something further.
or another work there still, and I went into sociology, and I've never known MIT to have a very radical politics, very like in the social sense, like you certainly have with talking about oppression and hierarchies. I'm curious where that came from in your biography and how that's been along your journey.
So I think something maybe I didn't mention here is also that trying to understand how people get to geekdom, hackerdom from different positions is important, right? So this narrative of mine, if you read ethnographies, even there's Biela Coleman, she writes about hacking, coding freedom, and the usual, the stereotypical narrative they give of hacker or programmer is that since a very early age they were tinkering with computers and solving problems, right? And what I'm trying to get at here is that we don't all come at it through that direction. It doesn't mean we don't have something to contribute to it or we don't associate with the values maybe, but we don't follow that sort of path. Not sure if I'm getting at your
Well, I
question.
was asking, like, in your own personal life, where did your, politics come from? Because they weren't mentioned, but you certainly expressed them. That you see power and you see, different levels of people having it, and that's certainly influencing your work. But I've never known MIT to be a place that fosters that per se.
Radical politics, but they are very liberal campus in a sense. No, I mean when I was there, it was interesting for me to be able to professors would sit with me and talk about homework and like solve problems together. I think that was radical in a sense, or that was a hacker attitude, if we want to call it. I mean, the hackers that were doing this tech model railroad club and Richard Stallman when he was there, they adopted the stance of like no politics, right? What we're doing is doesn't have to do with politics, doesn't have to do with race. But then people, especially when the Vietnam War came, said, wait a minute, you guys are funded by the Department of Defense. If you don't acknowledge that, you're just Department of Defense puppets. You might be developing things and making really cool stuff, which could be used for some other purpose. So I think it's interesting. You said they're not known for that radical politics, but maybe because they try to disassociate themselves from it. And that's another question I'm trying to get at in my research. What happens